feel very pleased and honoured to be here. Relate has been part of the backcloth of my life for as long as I can remember. 50 years ago, my uncle founded its sister organisation over in Dublin, and we heard a lot about that from him, I can tell you. And then my wife Elizabeth was a counsellor with Relate for 12 years. It's not very comfortable having an in-house counselor. But I have to say, I think it was her skills that kept us going through the ups and downs of turbulent married life with children and so on. So I appreciate their skills. Skills that have never been more needed today, as I'm sure you'll understand. It's a frenetic world out there, as Carrie said. Complexity is the new word in the sort of haunts that I frequent, dealing with complexity. It's hard to realize that it's 20 years only since that gentleman, English gentleman, over in CERN and came up with this strange idea that he was going to call the World Wide Web. Although all his colleagues said, it'll never catch on, Tim, it'll never catch on. Anyway, Tim Berners-Lee, as you know, invented the World Wide Web without realizing, I think, what a disruptive technology he was letting loose on the world. Because it has actually, in fundamental ways, changed the way we live and work, I think. We're all used to it now, particularly our grandchildren. I was talking to a farmer in the west of Ireland a couple of years ago. And he said, Charles, he said, it's a wonderful thing, this Skype thing, you know. He said, I was Skyping my daughter in California the other day, and suddenly I heard the bell go in her apartment, and she said, Dad, she said, could you keep an eye on young Harry while I go down and baby watching transcontinental, very good. But it reminded me of one of the problems, because I've lived long enough to know that no good things come without a sting in the tail. There's no unmixed blessings in this world. And whereas our iPhones and smartphones may be a real blessing for all of you, there's a sting in the tail. And so the Skype story reminded me that there's no place to hide. You know? You can Skype somebody and you can actually see inside their computers, with their permission, of course, but permission not usually refused to a boss. No place to hide. Last week, I was at a tea party, and I was talking to a gentleman who told me he had a family department store in Lincolnshire. And I said, how are things going in these difficult times? And he said to me, what time is it? I said, 20 past 5. Good, he said, they close at 5. He pulled out his iPhone, he pressed a few buttons, and he said, footwear down. And this time last year, that's bad. Flowers up, good, despite the weather. Fashion, men's fashion, up. Women's fashion, up. Kitchen materials, up. Compared with this time last year, very good on the whole, apart from the footwear. And I thought, my God, that's real-time data, isn't it? Now, but the worrying thing is that data came to him from the computer, not from the heads of department, who probably are on their way home and haven't seen it. Now, I'm sure he's a very nice man, but the temptation next morning to ring the footwear manager must be extreme. And so, there is no getting away from it. You may turn your things off, but you are imperative if you're the footwear manager. So, life is stressful, 24/7, all that sort of stuff, as you know only too well in your own lives. Now, I've no solution to what's happening. And I've no solution to the fact that what's happening in work is reverberating in the home. And what's happening in the home is reverberating at work. all I can do is give you a slightly different way, perhaps, of looking at it, and some examples. I'm not going to surprise any of you, I suspect, because everybody here has got experience of relationships, and you all know they have good moments and bad moments, and you all survive them in one way or another, or you wouldn't be here, I guess. But I hope I'll give you a little new way of looking at some things. Now, my way of dealing with complexity is actually simplicity. Because if you try to match complexity with complexity, you get complexity squared. And that's worse than ever. So I have a rather simple way of looking at life. You would probably say it's simplistic, but it helps me. It seems to me that there are 3 phases of life, rather like the French always used to say. They call them learning, working, and living when you got to a decent age. I call them the age or stage of exploration, when you are trying to discover who you are, what you can do, what you like doing, who you like, etc. The second stage is the stage of responsibility, or some would say the stage of exhaustion. And the last stage I call the stage of maturity. And oddly, I think they all last for about 30 years. And you think that's very odd. But I think, as I explained, 30 years of exploration, finding out who you are and what you can do, followed by 30 years of responsibility, which are exhausting, followed nowadays by 30 years of maturity, because you'll all live to 90. And your grandchildren will live to 100, at least a third of them, but, which is a frightening thought. Except I want to tell you it's an exciting thought. Now, my next bit of simplicity, and I think in 3s, I can't cope with 4s. The next bit of simplicity is to say that I think the secret to good living, to a good life, is actually to have a mixture of working, love, and learning. Love being a shorthand word for relationships of all sorts. In other words, you need to be working in some way or other. You need to be in some sort of relationships or community, and you need to be learning. Now, the point is, however, that the nature of those 3 things change as you move from one phase of life to the next. And I'll say briefly how they change and what they are. And it's the problem of changing as you move from one phase to the other, and changing the mix of working, loving, and learning that causes some of the problems, as I'll try to explain. Let me talk, first of all, a little briefly about the first stage, the stage of what I call exploration. It's I think, best described as being episodic. I mean, working, for instance, when you get to work, tends to be short-term. I mean, we encouraged our children in their 20s to experiment. I said to them once, please don't get a job. Because getting a job, well, they looked at me and they thought, I am the most indulgent dad they've ever seen. They're happy for me to go on welfare, get the dole. But I said, that's not exactly what I mean. What I mean is, rather than seek for employment, I would rather you found something that you could do that other people will actually pay you money for. Something you can make, some service you can provide that people will pay you money for. I don't know how much it is, I don't mind how much it is. But then when you do want a job, in other words, to sell your time to someone, they will ask you, yes, what grades you got, but more interested they will be in what you've been able to do that other people think worth paying for. And therefore, I would encourage all young people to spend a little of their time trying their hand at different things, including something that would make money if they sell it to somebody else. Episodic. 3 or 4 jobs in your 20s. And finding out which sort of ones you like. I mean, quite often, people have actually studied engineering because teaching engineering was rather good at teaching engineering. And then they discover later in life, very early in life, that they don't like engineering. But by then they probably got locked into it. So please experiment in my phase of exploration. And don't take life too seriously. Similarly with relationships. I expected our children to crash the car 3 times in their 20s and to have 3 different relationships, and hopefully they wouldn't marry the first one. Particularly our son's first one. And so they did. And luckily they married the 3rd one, and that was okay. So experiment, please, because how do you know who you are and what kind of person you would like to be with until you've explored? So don't make too firm commitments in your stage of exploration, please. And likewise, learning. And of course, school is a form of learning, but in my experience, quite a dangerous one. We forget that in a school, there's a curriculum, which is a thing that's written down and enforced by law in some countries, and indeed in this one now. But there's also an implicit curriculum, the messages that the school sends to you about society. For instance, that older people are more powerful than younger people and should be respected. That there are rules which must be obeyed or you get punished, etc., which you carry away with you. Plus, in my school, which was of course a long time ago, the message that came across to me was that all the problems of the world had already been solved. And the teacher had the answers in the back of his or her book. And my job was to find out what those answers were, to try and remember them, and to write them down again at the end of term or at the end of the year. Well, okay, I was quite a good memory and I got quite good grades. But the implicit message of that was that all the problems of the world had already been solved. So when I went out into the great big wide world, which was called Shell Oil, and went out to Far East Asia, when I encountered a problem which I didn't know how to solve, I thought, well, somebody else must know how to solve it because it's already been solved. So find a consultant, find a boss, ask for help. It never occurred to me that I could solve it for a long time. What was happening was that the school was teaching me the answers to what I call closed questions. A closed question, for instance, is how far is it to Birmingham? An open question is, why would anybody want to go to it? Or more interestingly, what should be the strategic decision for this organization? Or why should I marry this woman? Or what's the point of my life anyway? And so there was no instruction, help, or even warning that most of life is actually composed of open questions. So I'm not at all sure that you will get enough of the proper education and learning in your school. In fact, where you learn most, I believe now, to start with, is in the family, in the home. And that's why, when you go outside afterwards, you will see these pictures that were commissioned from Elizabeth, my wife, the photographer, by the Home Renaissance Foundation, to show images which she tried to capture of the family and the home as the school for life, where you learn the things that you don't normally learn at school. How to live in a community, how important work is, of all sorts, but particularly work that makes money, so that you appreciate that nothing can go on in the house unless there's money coming in, and the best way to get money coming in is through work. And that actually you can do work, even work that makes money, at quite an early stage.